Welcome to LatiNation, celebrating your generation from coast to coast. I'm your host, Humberto Guida. And I'm a huge fan of investigative documentaries about Latin America, because we as American Latinos have an obligation to understand the region of the world our families come from. And kicking off today's show is a harrowing and in-depth look into the search for justice in the case of the Dos Erres massacre in Guatemala in 1982. The documentary, titled Finding Oscar, is executive produced by Steven Spielberg and directed by Ryan Suffern. It follows the story of two little boys named Oscar and Ramiro, who were abducted during the genocide 25 years ago and raised by the very soldiers who destroyed their village. These boys offer the only living evidence that ties the Guatemalan government to the massacre, victims who have spent nearly 3 decades looking for answers. And it's a story you will only find on LatiNation.
Este evento da un giro de 120 grados a la investigación.
I'm Ryan Suffern. I directed and produced Finding Oscar.
Aquí estamos en las dos R's. Ya no hay un ser viviente aquí que viva casi.
The Guatemalan conflict stands out for the one-sidedness of the conflict, basically the Guatemalan military against leftist guerrillas.
Finding Oscar is a feature documentary that tells the story of a guy named Oscar who's Guatemalan born, and one day, he's in his early 30s, living in the suburbs of Boston, and one day he gets a phone call out of the blue from a special prosecutor in Guatemala. She says, "You don't know me, but I've been looking for you for almost 20 years, and I'm looking for you because I think you're one of the lone survivors of a massacre that took place in Guatemala, where the Guatemalan military essentially wiped out this entire village. You were too young to remember any of this because you were abducted at the age of 3 by one of the soldiers commanding this troop. And the person you think of as your father is actually this soldier who, you know, was involved with murdering not only your entire family, but your entire community."
Desgraciadamente, el año 1982, nadie sabía el terror. Cuesta recordar ese día.
Steven Spielberg is involved with this film for a few different reasons. One, my producing partner, Frank Marshall, has produced many films with Steven. They have a long history of collaborating together. Myself, I actually worked for Steven Spielberg as one of his on-set assistants. It's actually my entry point into documentary filmmaking, because one of my responsibilities working as Steven's shadow, essentially, on set while he was making movies, was that Steven wanted his on-set assistant to have a video camera. I had not only won the lottery of production assistants in getting the job, but I had the privilege of documenting, you know, one of the greatest filmmakers of our time. During the making of Schindler's List and after, Steven Spielberg started an organization called the Shoah Foundation. Their initial mission statement was to document the living testimonies from survivors of the Holocaust. Now the Shoah Foundation is vested in doing similar work in other genocides that have taken place in other countries. That's how we brought the project to him to see if he'd get involved.
Central America is simply too close for us to ignore the danger of governments seizing power there with ideological and military ties to the Soviet Union.
I really wanted to make this film accessible to you know, a North American audience that was probably like me, that would be unknowing and unassuming that this took place. Why don't North Americans care more about Central American issues and Latin American issues, particularly when our own country has played a significant role? I don't know the answer to that. And I'm just as guilty as the next person of knowing some stuff happened, you know, in Central America in the 80s and into the 90s. I see Finding Oscar and telling this story as hopefully a conversation starter. There's no period at the end of this story. If anything, I really hope folks leave the theater and want to investigate more and say, I never knew this happened. I never knew Ronald Reagan was in Honduras 2 days before this massacre, vouching for this dictator who is now, you know, potentially going to face charges for his role in this specific massacre. And it's like, why didn't I know that?